Every evening, the same porch light flickers to life in Iron Creek. Every evening, the same woman sits alone beneath it. She is the most beautiful woman in the entire territory. Men ride for miles just to catch a glimpse of her. Some tip their hats. Some stare too long. None of them ever stay past sundown. Yet when the sun goes down, she is always by herself. Nobody in town understood why. Nobody understood, until the day a stranger finally asked the question out loud. Iron Creek sat between two mountain ranges, proud and quiet, the kind of town travelers passed through but rarely remembered. Wooden porches lined the main street, worn smooth by years of boots. The general store opened at sunrise and closed when the last lantern in the saloon went dark. Children chased each other past the church on Sunday afternoons. Farmers argued over grain prices at the feed store, then shook hands anyway. The saloon glowed gold every night, full of laughter and gossip. Women gathered at the well each morning to trade rumors like coins, one bucket at a time. Sheriff Dale kept the peace with more patience than authority. The blacksmith's hammer marked the hours better than any clock, and every rumor in Iron Creek eventually circled back to one single name: Ilara Moss. On market mornings, Ilara walked to the square before the heat rose, her basket of preserves balanced on one arm. The shopkeeper's daughter always saved her the shaded corner stall, without ever being asked twice. An old rancher named Whit bought a jar of plum preserves every Saturday, though he never once finished one before the next visit. He said little beyond a nod and a coin, but he came back every week regardless, and in a town like Iron Creek, that counted as loyalty. Children sometimes stopped at her stall on their way to the schoolhouse, drawn by the smell of sugar and summer fruit. She always let them taste a spoonful for free, and always warned their mothers she'd done it, laughing at the mock outrage that followed. It was, most weeks, the only laughter Ilara allowed herself in public, brief and practiced, and gone by the time she reached her own front door. Ilara had not always been alone. 3 years earlier, a gold ring circled her finger, given to her on the steps of the very church the town still gathered at every Sunday. Her husband, Richard Moss, came from the wealthiest family in 3 counties. He courted her with flowers shipped in from Denver and promises whispered under the willow tree by the creek. He promised her a home, a family, a future built on his name and her devotion. For 2 years it seemed the town had been right to envy her. Then one morning he simply rode away. He left no letter, no explanation, no goodbye. His horse was gone from the stable before the rooster crowed. His side of the bed was cold by the time Ilara woke. She waited at the window until noon, certain he had ridden out for supplies. She waited until dusk, certain he would explain everything with a laugh. She was still waiting 3 years later, though she no longer called it waiting. The town whispered that she must have done something wrong. A man does not leave a good wife, they said at the well, over coffee, in hushed voices behind gloved hands. Nobody asked if a woman could survive shame alone in a house built for 2. Nobody asked what it cost her to keep sweeping that porch every single morning, as if someone might still come home to see it clean. Ilara asked herself that question every single night. She kept his rocking chair on the porch, empty, untouched, its wood softened silver by years of sun and rain. She told herself she was waiting for an apology that would never come. Really, in the quiet parts of herself she rarely visited, she was waiting to prove she deserved to be chosen in the first place. She sold preserves at the Saturday market to keep herself busy. She tended a small garden behind the house, though half of it had gone to weeds. She smiled when the town smiled at her, and closed the door quietly when it did not. She had grown skilled at surviving in plain sight, which is its own kind of loneliness. Caleb Hart arrived in Iron Creek on a Tuesday, driving 40 head of cattle south toward the rail line. He was not looking for romance. He was not looking for anything but work, quiet, and a bed that didn't move under him. He had buried a wife 2 winters before up in Cheyenne, after a fever took her in 11 days. Since then he spoke little and trusted less, and moved from town to town the way some men move from bottle to bottle. He was not an unkind man. He simply no longer expected kindness in return. Before Cheyenne, before the fever, Caleb had believed staying in one place was a kind of promise a man made to the people he loved. He'd built a small cabin with his own hands, planted an orchard that never had time to bear fruit, and buried his wife beneath the one tree that survived. He sold the cabin within the month, unable to sleep under a roof that still smelled faintly of her. Since then, Movement had felt safer than Roots, and Roots had felt like a debt he wasn't sure he could afford to owe again. He paid the boy at the stable double to feed his horse well. He stopped in the street to let an old dog cross ahead of his cattle. He answered questions from strangers with short, honest sentences, never more than the question required. He noticed the porch light before he noticed the woman beneath it, glowing steady against the dark like it was waiting on something. He noticed the woman before he noticed the whispers already following her name through town. Caleb's horse threw a shoe outside the Moss house, 2 streets past the stable, on his second evening in Iron Creek. He knelt in the dust, cursing under his breath, working the loose shoe free with his knife. Ilara stepped out onto the porch before he even knocked, a tin cup of water already in her hand, as if she had been waiting for a reason to leave the house. "You'll want to soak that hoof before you ride further," she said. He looked up, surprised by the offer, more surprised by the kindness in it. He thanked her, drank the water, and noticed she did not go back inside right away. She stood at the fence, watching the mountains instead of watching him, the way people do when they've learned not to expect company to stay. "Every evening you're out here alone," he said. "Why?" She almost lied. She had a dozen easy answers ready, worn smooth from years of use. Instead, something about his tired, honest face made her tell him the truth. "Because nobody in this town has asked me a real question in 3 years." Caleb said nothing to that. He simply sat down on the porch step, uninvited, unhurried, and stayed until the stars came out over the mountains. For the first time in longer than she could count, Ilara was not sitting alone. He came back the next evening. He told himself it was only to check on his horse's hoof, though the stable was in the opposite direction. He came back the evening after that with no excuse at all. Ilara began setting out 2 cups instead of 1, though she never mentioned doing it, and he never mentioned noticing. He fixed her fence without being asked, replacing 3 rotted posts in a single Sunday afternoon. She brought him coffee while he worked and stayed to hand him nails, though he needed no help holding them. Before the first storm of the season, he climbed onto her roof and nailed down shingles loosened by wind. She stood below holding the ladder, insisting the whole time that he didn't have to, though she never once asked him to stop. One evening, rain kept them both on the porch longer than planned. Ilara brought out an old book, its spine cracked from years of handling, and opened it to show him a pressed wildflower kept flat between the pages. "The last happy day," she said quietly, not offering more. Caleb didn't ask what day it had been or with whom. He simply understood that some things did not need explaining to be honored, and let the silence between them hold it gently. Later that same season, Caleb spoke of his late wife for the first time since arriving in Iron Creek. He told Ilara about the fever, about the 11 days, about the silence of the cabin afterward. His voice stayed steady through most of it, but his eyes did not. Ilara did not offer comfort in words. She reached over and simply held his hand, and he let her, which surprised them both. They planted a small garden together behind the house that spring, clearing the weeds Ilara had let overtake half the plot. Rows of beans went in first, then early corn, then a patch of wildflowers Caleb insisted on planting without saying why. Ilara laughed while pulling weeds beside him. A real laugh, loud and startled at itself, the first one the porch had heard in 3 years. Not every evening between them passed easily. One night, Caleb arrived late, smelling faintly of the saloon, quieter than usual and slower to meet her eyes. Ilara asked if something was wrong, and he brushed the question aside the way he'd learned to brush aside most things that mattered. She told him plainly that she'd had enough of men who rode away from hard conversations, even if he was only riding away from this one in his own head. Caleb sat with that for a long moment before answering. He admitted Richard's name had come up at the saloon that evening, along with old questions about why a drifter would bother courting another man's wife in all but name. He hadn't known how to answer them, and hated that the not knowing had followed him all the way to her porch. Ilara didn't offer easy comfort. She simply said that whatever he decided, he owed her the truth of it, not his silence. He nodded and came back the very next evening with nothing held back, which was, in its own way, the beginning of real trust between them. In early summer, the town held its annual barn dance, and for once, Ilara did not plan to attend alone in spirit, even while standing in a crowded room. Caleb arrived in a clean shirt he'd clearly borrowed and asked her to dance before he lost the nerve to. They moved carefully across the floor, unpracticed and unhurried, while half the town pretended not to watch them, and the other half didn't bother pretending at all. Walking her home afterward, neither of them spoke much, both still catching their breath from the music and the dancing. At her gate, Caleb hesitated, turning his hat over once in his hands before finally speaking. "I wasn't planning on staying in one place again," he admitted. "I'm having a harder time remembering why not, the longer I sit on that porch step." Ilara didn't answer with words. She simply left the gate open behind her when she walked through it, and he understood the invitation for exactly what it was. Slowly, the town noticed a stranger sitting where no one else ever would. Mrs. Pratt, the loudest voice at the well, began to talk before the dance had even ended. Then, on a cold morning in late summer, a well-dressed man stepped off the eastbound stagecoach. Richard Moss had returned to Iron Creek 3 years and 2 seasons after he left it. Word spread before he even reached the street. Richard claimed business in the territory, cattle interests, land he still held title to somewhere north of town. Everyone in Iron Creek knew the real reason within the hour. A man does not return to a town he abandoned unless something in it still belongs to him. And everyone knew exactly what he considered his. Richard arrived at Ilara's porch that same evening, dressed finer than any man in Iron Creek could afford, his boots barely dusted from the road. "A wife's place is with her husband," he said, as though 3 years and a broken promise had simply been an inconvenient errand. "You left without a word," Ilara said, standing her ground on the top step. "You don't get to return and demand one." Richard's charm, practiced and easy, faded into something colder at the refusal. He reminded her of her reputation, of what the town still whispered, of how few options a woman in her position truly had. He left without another word, but not before promising he would return and that she would reconsider once she'd had time to think clearly. From across the street, Caleb watched Richard leave Ilara's porch, hat pulled low, jaw tight. He did not know what had been said between them. He only knew a husband, however absent, however unwanted, had a claim the whole town still recognized as real. That night, Richard found Caleb at the saloon and did not bother lowering his voice. "She'll always belong to Iron Creek's oldest name," he said, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Men like you just keep her company until I'm ready to come home." Laughter followed, uneasy and brief, and Caleb said nothing, though his hands stayed still on the bar with visible effort. Mrs. Pratt saw her chance and spread the story further before sunrise. "The husband's come back for her," she told anyone who'd listen at the well the next morning. "That drifter never stood a chance, and he ought to know it." The rumor spread through Iron Creek faster than any truth ever could, the way rumors always outrun the people they wound. Iron Creek split slowly into 2 uneven camps over the following days. Mrs. Pratt and her circle at the well insisted a wife belonged to her husband's name, regardless of what that husband had done to earn otherwise. Whit the rancher said little on the matter publicly, but left an extra jar's worth of coin at Ilara's stall that Saturday, and looked her steadily in the eye while doing it. Sheriff Dale, sworn to stay neutral in matters outside the law, made a point of tipping his hat to Ilara, twice as often as before, which in Iron Creek everyone understood as a kind of quiet vote. The next evening, Caleb did not come to her porch. He told himself he was giving Richard's claim its due respect, giving Ilara room to choose without a stranger's shadow over the decision. Really, for the first time since Cheyenne, he was afraid of losing something before he'd even let himself call it his. Ilara sat alone again that evening, the second chair empty beside her, certain she had been right about herself all along. She was a woman men left, not a woman men chose to stay for. She blew out the lantern earlier than usual, unwilling to watch the road for a shadow that wasn't coming. Days passed in a heavy, uncertain silence. Richard returned twice more, each visit colder than the last, each time more certain that loneliness alone would eventually wear her down. Ilara stopped answering the door by the 3rd visit, though she still heard his boots on the porch steps every time, and still lay awake afterward, furious at herself for listening. Caleb kept to the edges of town during those days, working odd jobs at the stable, avoiding the street that led past her house. He told himself distance was a kindness. He was beginning quietly to believe it was only cowardice wearing kindness as a disguise. 3 days later, a fire broke out at the Pratt barn in the middle of the night, sparked by an overturned lantern in the hayloft. The flames climbed fast through dry summer straw, lighting the sky orange over half the street. Ilara was the first to reach the town well, buckets already in hand, before most of Iron Creek had even woken to the shouting. She worked through the smoke long after her arms gave out, passing buckets down a line that grew longer with every passing minute. She pushed her way toward the barn itself when word spread that 2 horses remained trapped inside, ignoring the men who told her it wasn't safe. She freed the first horse by cutting its lead rope with a kitchen knife she still carried from home. She went back for the second, though the smoke had thickened enough to blind her by then. Richard stood at the edge of the gathered crowd and did not move to help. His fine coat spared any risk of soot or damage. Caleb ran straight into the smoke without a single word of hesitation, following the sound of Ilara's coughing toward the back stalls. He found her on her knees beside the second horse, one hand still gripping its lead rope, refusing to let go even as her strength failed her. He carried her out through the collapsing doorway as the roof gave way behind them both. She was coughing, blackened with soot, barely able to stand but alive and holding tight to his sleeve the entire way to open air. The whole street watched him lay her gently on the grass, watched her hand find his and refuse to let go, watched something unspoken finally become impossible to deny. Mrs. Pratt, ashamed for perhaps the first time in years, pushed through the crowd to kneel beside them both. "She saved my horses when my own husband stood there and watched," she said, voice breaking in front of the whole gathered town. "She never did anything but survive what was done to her, and I helped make that survival harder than it needed to be." By the time the flames were finally beaten back, half of Iron Creek stood soot-streaked and exhausted in the street, staring at the woman they'd spent 3 years whispering about. Whit the rancher was the first to say it plainly, loud enough for the whole crowd to hear. "That's twice now she's run into danger, while the rest of us stood around debating her character." No one argued with him, and for the first time, the silence that followed felt like agreement instead of judgment. Richard watched the town turn its back on him, one neighbor at a time, through the smoke and the grey light of early morning. By the time full dawn arrived, his room at the boarding house stood empty, his stagecoach fare already paid in advance. Iron Creek did not ask where he'd gone, and for the first time in 3 years, neither did Ilara. The town gathered outside the Moss house that evening, uncertain what to say to a woman who had nearly died saving a rival's horses. Caleb walked through the crowd without acknowledging any of them and stopped at the base of her porch steps, hat in his hands. "I stopped coming because I was afraid of their words," he said, looking up at her for the first time in days. "I should have been afraid of losing you instead. That fear would have taught me something worth knowing sooner." Ilara looked at the empty chair beside her, silvered by years of weather and waiting, then looked back down at him. "I don't need you to save my reputation," she said, her voice steadier than she expected it to be. "The town can think what it wants of me. I need you to stay, and I need you to mean it this time." "I mean it," Caleb said. "I've meant it since the night your porch light was the only thing in this whole territory that looked like it was waiting for someone worth the wait." Caleb climbed the steps and sat down in the chair beside her, and this time he did not plan on leaving before morning, or the morning after that, or any morning that followed. The porch light still flickers every evening in Iron Creek, steady as it ever was. But the rocking chair beside Ilara's is never empty anymore, its wood warming again under regular use, instead of standing silvered and still. By spring, the small garden behind the house had grown full and green, rows of beans and corn, and one stubborn patch of wildflowers nobody ever thinned out. Neighbors who once whispered at the well now stopped to admire that garden on their way past, and sometimes even say so out loud. Mrs. Pratt brings preserves of her own most Saturdays now, an apology delivered in the only language the town truly understands. Sheriff Dale tips his hat to both of them whenever their paths cross on the street, no longer bothering to hide a small, approving smile. Neighbors say Ilara Moss finally got the life she deserved, the one the town assumed had passed her by for good. Ilara says, on the rare evenings she speaks of it at all, that she simply stopped waiting to be chosen and learned to choose too, which made all the difference in the world. Some evenings, laughter still drifts from that porch long after sundown, carrying over the fence and down the quiet street. Children passing by sometimes slow their steps just to listen, though they couldn't say exactly why the sound feels worth stopping for. And the whole territory in time came to agree on one simple truth about the most beautiful woman anyone in Iron Creek had ever known. She was never really alone. A year later, almost to the week of the fire, Iron Creek held its barn dance again, rebuilt on the very ground where the old one had burned. Ilara wore blue that evening, the same faded shade as the dress she'd worn the night Caleb first sat on her porch step uninvited. Fayette the rancher finally finished a full jar of preserves in one sitting and told anyone who'd listen that he'd been saving the good news for the right occasion. Mrs. Pratt, older and softer around the edges than she used to be, asked Ilara to dance with her own husband first, an apology delivered without a single word needed to explain it. Caleb watched from the edge of the floor, hat in his hands again, the same way he'd stood on her porch steps that difficult evening a year before. When the fiddle slowed, he crossed the room and asked Ilara for the next dance, though by then in Iron Creek everyone already knew the answer before she gave it. She was never really alone. She was only ever waiting for the right person to finally sit down,